White Pine Lake, Montana. The kind of winter that doesn't shout, it just settles in and stays. Snow presses down on the pines like a heavy hand, and the lake below looks more like a mirror of steel than water. Somewhere along that frozen shoreline stands a small cabin, its chimney breathing thin ribbons of smoke into the pale morning sky. Inside lives Samuel Reed, 58 years old, a retired U.S. Marine who has long since learned the discipline of silence. His days follow a rhythm older than comfort: rise before dawn, light the stove, grind the coffee beans, and brew 2 cups, one for himself and one for the woman who no longer sits across the table. Her name was Helen. She used to hum softly while reading near the fire, a tune that never found words. Cancer took her slow and unkindly, and in the years since, silence has become Samuel's only language. He keeps her photograph on the mantel, a simple frame of oak, the glass smudged where his fingers rest each Friday when he wipes the dust away. The other constant in his mornings is the second cup of coffee, steaming and untouched. It's not a superstition. It's a promise that love, even gone still, deserves a place at the table. His son Aaron calls sometimes from Oregon, polite, brief conversations about weather and work. They mean well, both of them, but distance has a way of teaching people how not to reach. Samuel has a granddaughter, Lily, whom he's never met in person. He knows her only through photographs Aaron sends once in a while, a gap-toothed smile, a birthday balloon, a little girl who probably doesn't know his voice. So the cabin remains quiet. The only sounds are the stove ticking, the whisper of snow against the glass, and the faint crackle of an old AM radio that plays more static than speech. Outside, the world is white and still, until one morning it isn't. That day, while bringing in firewood, Samuel notices a set of paw prints crossing the yard, small, light, and fresh. They stop near the porch steps, then vanish back into the woods. Not a fox, not a coyote, too round, too deliberate. Something else. That night, the temperature drops hard. The wind rattles the shutters. And just past midnight, Samuel hears a sound, faint but real, a soft whimper carried by the storm. He stands by the door hand, hovering over the latch. Old instincts tell him to stay put. Compassion tells him to look. When he finally opens the door, the snow gusts in like smoke, and there, half buried in white, stands a young German shepherd, ribs, visible fur clumped with ice. One ear droops, the other stands as if uncertain of its duty. The dog doesn't bark. He simply looks up at Samuel, not begging, not afraid, just waiting. Samuel kneels, his boots crunching on the frozen porch. "Where'd you come from, boy?" he murmurs, voice rough from disuse. The dog takes one slow step forward, then stops. Their eyes meet through the storm. One man, one creature, both shaped by loneliness, both unsure who saved whom by standing there. Samuel takes a piece of bread from the kitchen, sets it on the railing, and steps back inside. When he checks again at dawn, the bread is gone. And for the first time in years, he pours that second cup of coffee with a faint, unfamiliar feeling stirring beneath the quiet. Something had crossed the snow in the night and left a mark he couldn't erase. The next morning came pale and still, the kind of silence that only Montana winters know, a silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat in it. Samuel Reed stood by the window, coffee steaming in his hands, eyes scanning the tree line beyond the porch. There was no movement, no sound, only the soft sweep of wind laying new snow over the old. He told himself the dog had moved on. That's what wild things do. They come close to warmth, then remember, they don't belong. Still that evening, he tore a small piece of bread from his supper, dark rye, rough-edged, and placed it again on the railing outside, just in case. When he checked the next morning, the bread was gone, the snow brushed smooth where something had stood. From then on, it became a ritual. Every day, Samuel began saving a piece of his own meal, half of his bread, part of the fish, sometimes a slice of bacon he'd have otherwise eaten himself. He'd leave it out on the porch railing before dusk, no words spoken, no whistle, no call. And each dawn, it would be gone. By the 4th day, he noticed the paw prints again, this time closer to the steps. By the 6th, they reached the top of the porch. And on the 7th morning, when he opened the door with his coffee in hand, the German shepherd was sitting right there waiting. The pup's fur still hung in matted patches, but its eyes looked clearer now. Cautious, yes, but no longer desperate. It didn't flinch when Samuel stepped out. It simply watched, ears twitching, tail curled around its paws for warmth. Samuel knelt slowly, careful not to startle it. "Well," he said softly, "looks like you've decided this is your post." The dog tilted its head as if trying to translate his tone. Then with the smallest movement of trust, it leaned forward and sniffed his gloved hand before retreating again to the edge of the porch. Samuel smiled, a quiet, forgotten expression that felt strange on his face. "All right then," he murmured. "You can stay close. Just don't expect table manners." That night he set out a full plate, scraps of bread soaked in broth and a bit of salmon. He didn't know why, but he couldn't bear the thought of that small heartbeat out there hungry in the cold. When he woke before dawn, the plate was clean, and for the first time in years the cabin didn't feel quite as empty. The next morning the dog came earlier, before sunrise, and waited by the porch, tail tapping once like a small salute. Samuel began talking to it as he worked short phrases, the kind that filled the air without demanding answers. "You'd hate the desert heat," he said once while splitting wood. "Another day. You're a quiet one. Suits me fine." He started to look forward to the small prints in the snow. He noticed how the dog limped slightly on one paw, how one ear drooped lower than the other, how its breath rose in small white clouds that drifted toward him like questions. And slowly, without planning to, Samuel began setting aside a full portion of every meal, one for him, one for the dog. At dinner he'd look at the empty chair across the table, the one that used to belong to Helen, and then at the food by the door. It no longer felt strange to share what little he had, because somehow he knew, out there in the storm, a life was waiting on him, the same way he'd been waiting on something he couldn't name. That night, as he turned off the lamp, he caught himself whispering into the dark, "Good night, boy. Stay close." And just before sleep took him, he could have sworn he heard a faint sound, a soft single bark carried by the wind, like an answer. The mornings came colder now, but they also came with company. Each day, just after dawn, the shepherd appeared at the porch, quiet, steady, and expectant. He no longer looked like a lost creature. He looked like he belonged to the rhythm of the cabin. Samuel began calling him Ranger. He didn't say it out loud at first. He simply thought it, the name fitting somehow, like it had been waiting for the right voice. Then one morning, while setting the plate of food by the step, he said softly, "Here you go, Ranger." The dog paused mid-step, ears flicking toward him. It was the first time Samuel saw that look, alert but calm, like a soldier recognizing his name during roll call. From that moment, Ranger stayed longer after eating. Sometimes he'd sit near the porch until the sun rose over the lake, his breath forming soft clouds that caught the light. Samuel found himself studying every detail, the uneven rhythm of the dog's gait, the faint scar along its flank, the way its tail never wagged wildly, but gave slow, deliberate sways, as if manners had been trained into him long ago. That night Samuel opened an old sketchbook he hadn't touched since Helen died. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and graphite. He sharpened a pencil and began to draw careful lines at first, just the shape of the head, the drooping ear, the strength in the shoulders. He wasn't an artist, but he had the patience of one. Each night he added a few more strokes, the curve of the paw, the slope of the back, the shadow under the eye. It became a new ritual, one he hadn't known he needed. Sometimes he'd catch himself talking to the unfinished drawing. "You look a little tougher today," he'd murmur. Or, "You've seen more than you tell, haven't you?" It was the kind of small, absent-minded conversation a lonely man has when he's learning how to speak again. Outside, Ranger curled near the cabin wall where the heat from the stove seeped through the logs. When Samuel glanced through the frosted window, he'd see the dog's faint outline against the snow, a dark, steady shape keeping watch through the night. The days passed that way, small exchanges, silent companionship. Samuel noticed how the dog's limp improved, how his fur began to shine again. He jotted notes in the margin of his sketchbook. Day 10, Ranger eats calmly, limp easing, watches me work. Another night he added, stayed by porch all evening, listens when spoken to. He didn't realize he was building more than a record. He was building connection, something he hadn't dared to rebuild since Helen's death. When the wind howled outside, he would sit by the fire and sketch while Ranger dozed against the cabin wall. The sound of the pencil on paper, the dog's slow breathing, and the crackle of the wood stove became the house's new heartbeat. Samuel sometimes thought of his son Aaron, how distant their words had become. There was so much unsaid between them, too many winters of silence. But every time he looked at Ranger, he felt that maybe, just maybe, life still had a way of sending back what time had taken. One night, after finishing a rough sketch of the dog's face, Samuel turned it toward the firelight. The eyes he'd drawn looked back at him, loyal, alert, alive. He smiled, the pencil resting in his hand. "Well, Ranger," he said quietly, "looks like it's just you and me now." Outside, as if in answer, the dog lifted his head and gave a low, contented sound, not a bark, not a whine, but something in between. A sound that said, "I hear you." And from that moment, Samuel knew this was no longer just a stray that came for food. This was a presence that came to stay. Winter in Montana has its own kind of silence, not empty, but deep, like the world holding its breath. For Samuel Reed, that silence used to be unbearable. Now it was simply the space between two heartbeats, his and Ranger's. Each morning began the same way, 2 cups of coffee steaming on the table, the radio whispering low from the shelf, and Ranger waiting outside the porch tail, sweeping the snow in quiet greeting. Samuel had stopped thinking of the second cup as Helen's. He still poured it, yes, out of habit, out of love, but these days when he looked at it, he sometimes thought of the dog. Because somehow, in a way he couldn't explain, Ranger carried a piece of the same calm, patient warmth that Helen once brought into the room. The sketches in Samuel's old notebook had grown into a small collection. He wasn't drawing for skill, he drew to remember. He captured every little change, the light catching on Ranger's fur, the healed paw now steady under him, the way one ear still tilted, making him look forever curious. When the storms came, Samuel worked by the fire. The pencil's faint scratch on paper mixed with the sound of crackling logs. He would glance up sometimes and find Ranger lying by the door, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but never quite asleep. The dog never seemed to rest fully, as if some part of him was always on duty, watching over the man who had given him warmth. Sometimes Samuel would talk while he drew. Not the kind of talk that expects a reply, just soft, unfinished sentences. "You'd like the mountains in spring," he'd murmur. "Used to hike them with Helen before her lungs got weak." Or, "My boy Aaron. I don't know if he'd even recognize this place anymore." The dog would lift his head then, just a little, as if listening. It was enough. For a man who had spent years surrounded by silence, the smallest sound of understanding was more than words. When the light faded, Samuel would set down his pencil, take one last look at the drawing, and smile faintly. "You look good tonight, Ranger," he'd say. Then he'd rise, toss another log on the fire, and check the latch on the door, a Marine's habit that never left him. Outside, the wind would bend through the pines, carrying snowflakes like dusted stars. Ranger would lift his head, ears turning toward the sound. Then, satisfied, he'd curl up again. Over time, something shifted inside the cabin, something invisible but unmistakable. The air no longer felt stale. The walls didn't echo so much. Samuel began to notice small things again, how the frost etched delicate patterns on the window panes, how the lake reflected the morning sky like cracked glass, how Ranger's breath in the early hours rose and fell with the same rhythm as his own. He had learned through the years that grief never truly leaves. It just becomes a language, one you speak quietly through gestures instead of words. And somehow the dog understood that language better than any human could. One morning, Samuel added a note to the margin of his sketchbook, day 24. "He stays close even when I don't speak. Trust, I think, doesn't need sound." He paused, staring at those words. Then he closed the book and reached down to rest a hand on Ranger's head. The fur was warm, thick, alive. "Good boy," he whispered. "You've got more patience than most people I knew." That night, as snow fell heavy outside, he sat by the fire and opened Helen's old box of pencils, the ones she used when she was still teaching art to children in town. The cedar scent hit him like memory. He picked the softest one, the one she'd worn short, with her fingers, and began shading the outline of Ranger's face. Every stroke felt like stitching a wound closed, not just his, but the years between who he'd been and who he was now. At some point, he realized the lines had stopped being about the dog at all. They were about life, about second chances, about something finding you again when you thought you were past being found. When the drawing was done, he tore it carefully from the book, placed it in a small wooden frame, and set it beside Helen's photograph on the mantel. He didn't say anything at first. Then quietly, "You'd like him, Helen. He listens." Ranger, lying by the fire, lifted his head and looked toward her photo as if he understood the introduction. Samuel chuckled, his eyes damp but smiling. "Yeah," he said softly. "You'd both get along." Outside, the storm eased into silence. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight, the air thick with warmth and graphite dust. For the first time in years, Samuel didn't dread the long Montana night. He leaned back in his chair, watching the flames dance in the stove, and whispered to no one in particular, "Guess I'm not as alone as I thought." And in that moment, between the quiet of loss and the gentle breathing of the dog by the hearth, something inside him finally began to thaw. By late January, winter had wrapped White Pine Lake in silence thick as glass. The pines bowed low with snow, the lake slept under ice, and every sound, even a breath, seemed to echo longer than it should. But inside the small cabin, something new was stirring, warmth that came not from fire, but from company. Ranger was no longer a guest. He was part of the routine now, the morning watch, the evening companion, the steady shape beside the door. Every sunrise began the same 2 cups of coffee, one for Samuel Reed, one untouched beside the empty chair. Outside, Ranger would be waiting, his fur tipped with frost, his breath white in the cold. Samuel talked to him more these days, not out of habit, but out of comfort. "You're early again," he'd say with a quiet smile. Ranger would tilt his head as if amused by the accusation. At noon, when Samuel chopped wood, the dog followed close, sitting at a distance, but always watching. When the axe bit the stump, Ranger's ears twitched, but he never flinched. He'd learned the rhythm of the work, when to move, when to stay, when to wait for the man to finish. There were evenings when Samuel cooked more than he needed, half out of forgetfulness, half because he no longer cooked for one. The plate by the door had become permanent. Bread soaked in broth, bits of salmon, slices of potato, all served with quiet ceremony, the same care a man once gave to a family dinner. Sometimes Samuel caught himself whispering dinner time as if Helen were still there setting the table. Then he'd smile, shake his head, and add, "Come on, Ranger. Don't let it get cold." He couldn't say when it happened exactly, the moment the dog stopped being a visitor and became his. Maybe it was the morning he opened the door and found Ranger waiting with a piece of bark in his mouth, tail slow and deliberate like an offering. Or maybe it was the night he woke to find the dog pressed against the cabin wall, keeping the wind from slipping through the cracks. Either way, the loneliness that had ruled this house for years had started to loosen its hold. There were still nights when memories pressed in, when Samuel woke from dreams of desert dust, of echoes of war and loss. But now, instead of reaching for the old pistol under his bed, he'd hear Ranger's low breathing near the door and remember where he was. Safe. Home. Not alone. He kept drawing, too. Not just one sketch, but many. Pages filled with pencil lines, light and rough. Ranger sitting by the fire. Ranger looking out over the frozen lake. Ranger sleeping beside the boots by the door. Sometimes he left the sketchbook open and the dog would rest his head beside it, as if posing for one more unfinished portrait. Samuel began noticing things he hadn't noticed in years. The way the sunlight hit the icicles at noon, turning them into thin glass candles. The way snow fell quietly like forgiveness. The way the firelight caught in Ranger's eyes, reflecting something old and kind, not wildness, but recognition. He even caught himself laughing once, really laughing, when Ranger tried to chase a squirrel and ended up buried nose first in a snowbank. "Smooth move, soldier," Samuel chuckled, helping him out. The dog shook himself, showering snow everywhere, and for a heartbeat the cabin yard felt alive again, like life had remembered the address it once forgot. When the radio played in the evenings, Samuel let it run longer now. The old AM host Walt talked about small-town life letters from listeners and the weather across the northern states. Ranger seemed to like the voice. He'd sit near the radio, ears perked as if following the stories. "Guess you like company too," Samuel said once, pouring himself another cup of coffee. The dog blinked slow, that same quiet signal of trust, and laid his head on his paws. The weather turned harsher mid-February. Wind screamed down the valley and snow buried the cabin halfway up the windows. Samuel worked harder chopping wood, checking the chimney-clearing paths, and Ranger never left his side. He carried small sticks in his mouth, dragged a glove when Samuel dropped it, even pressed against his leg as if to steady him on the ice. The bond between them was no longer fragile. It had weight, the kind you could lean on. Each night before turning in, Samuel would look over at Ranger lying by the fire and whisper, "You did good today, boy." Sometimes half asleep he'd add, "Helen would have liked you." Ranger never stirred, but his tail would give a single soft thump as if agreeing. One particularly cold evening when the sky glowed faintly green with northern lights, Samuel stood at the porch watching the colors dance over the lake. Ranger sat beside him, shoulder to his knee. The air was sharp, clean, endless. "You ever wonder," Samuel said quietly, "why things find each other when they're broken?" The dog lifted his head toward the sky, ears pricked eyes reflecting the aurora. Samuel nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The wind moved through the pines, carrying a sound almost like breath, like the world exhaling. Inside on the table, the sketchbook lay open to the last drawing, Ranger sleeping by the fire, Samuel's handwriting beneath it. Companions of the Cold. Day 40. And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't just shelter a man. It sheltered a friendship, quiet, steadfast, and alive in the heart of a frozen world. The storm came without warning. One moment the air was still, the next the wind screamed through the trees like something alive, the kind of cold that makes windows shudder and nails groan in the wood. Inside the cabin, Samuel Reed stirred the fire higher, stacking logs with methodical precision, a Marine's way of fighting what can't be fought. Ranger lay by the door half asleep, his fur glinting amber in the firelight. Every so often he'd lift his head toward the sound of the wind and rumble a low growl like a sentry checking the perimeter. Samuel chuckled softly. "Easy, soldier. Just weather doing what it does." But the storm grew angrier. Snow hit the windows in sheets, hissing like sand. The radio crackled and died. Power flickered once, then held. Samuel felt the cabin tremble, old timber complaining under the weight. He sat down slowly, breathing through the ache that had begun in his chest earlier that evening. He told himself it was nothing, too much coffee, maybe. Still, the pain didn't ease. It tightened, spreading up toward his shoulder. He pressed a hand against his ribs and leaned forward, trying to breathe deep, slow, controlled. "Not now," he muttered. "Not tonight." Ranger's ears pricked. He stood tail stiff, watching Samuel. The man tried to wave him off. "I'm fine, boy. Just need a minute." But the next wave hit harder. It felt like a heavy hand squeezing the life out of him. His vision blurred, the room spinning with firelight and shadow. He tried to stand, but his knees gave out. The coffee cup shattered on the floor, the dark liquid seeping across the wood like spilled ink. Ranger moved before thought. He barked once, sharp, urgent, then again louder, the sound cutting through the storm outside. Samuel clutched his chest, gasping. "Go on," he whispered, half to himself, half to the dog. "Go. Get help." It was a command Ranger seemed to understand. He circled Samuel once, whined low, then bolted for the door. The storm swallowed him whole. Outside, the snow was knee-deep, the wind slicing through the trees like knives. Ranger fought his way forward, head down, chest plowing through the drifts. He knew where to go. The scent of Laura Hayes, the ranger who checked the cabin, still lingered on the road that led to her post. A mile of snow in a storm could bury a man. For a dog, it was a gauntlet. He ran, slid, fell, got up again, driven by something stronger than instinct. Back at the cabin, Samuel lay on the floor, his breathing shallow. The clock ticked each second louder, heavier. He thought of Helen, her hand in his, the faint smile she'd given him before the hospital lights faded. He thought of Aaron, his son, the last phone call they'd ended too quickly. And he thought of the dog of the trust that had walked out into the storm to save him. Outside, time blurred. When Ranger finally reached the ranger's outpost, he was little more than a shadow in the white. Laura Hayes was checking the power lines when she heard the barking, frantic, desperate. She turned her flashlight toward the sound and froze. "Ranger," she called, recognizing the shepherd from the old Marine's porch. The dog whined, circling, then dashed back into the storm, stopping only to look back at her. "Oh, God," she breathed, grabbing her coat. "All right, show me." She followed him through the whiteout, the beam of her light cutting through snow like a blade. Her lungs burned, but Ranger never stopped. He barked once every few seconds like a living flare guiding her through the dark. When they reached the cabin, the door was half open, snow curling in. Laura rushed inside. Samuel lay motionless by the hearth, one hand still clutching the edge of the rug. "Mr. Reed," she shouted, kneeling beside him. He was pale but breathing barely. Ranger circled them, whining, pawing at Samuel's shoulder as if to say, "Do something." Laura radioed for help, her voice steady but tight. "Dispatch, this is Hayes at White Pine Lake. I've got a cardiac emergency. Male, late 50s. Send paramedics now, coordinates inbound." She checked his pulse, weak, uneven, then grabbed a blanket and covered him. "Hang on, sir." "They're coming," she whispered. Samuel's eyes flickered open for half a second. He saw her then, Ranger. The dog's muzzle was close, warm breath against his cheek. "You came back," he rasped, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then everything went dark again. The next thing he knew, there was light, bright, sterile, and humming. The air smelled like antiseptic and linen. He turned his head and saw the heart monitor blinking slow, steady. And there, curled at the foot of the hospital bed, was Ranger. The nurse said they tried to make the dog wait outside, but he wouldn't leave. He kept pushing past the door, she'd said with a grin. "We figured he earned the right to stay." Samuel reached out, hand trembling, and brushed his fingers through the shepherd's fur. "Good boy," he whispered, voice hoarse. "You really are a ranger, aren't you?" The dog's tail moved once, a small, tired thump, and he rested his head on Samuel's knee. The doctor said later that another hour and he wouldn't have made it. But somehow in a whiteout blizzard, a stray shepherd had found help and led it straight to him. That night, when the nurses left and the hospital lights dimmed, Samuel lay awake, listening to the slow rhythm of the heart monitor. Ranger slept beside him, chest rising and falling with the same calm beat. Samuel looked toward the window where snow still drifted under the lamplight. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "You saved my life, Helen, and you sent him to finish the job." Outside, the storm had finally stopped. Inside, two heartbeats kept time together. One man, one dog, both given a second chance at life. Spring came slow to Montana that year, as if the earth itself needed time to catch its breath after all that cold. Snow still clung to the shadows of the pines, but the lake began to soften, the ice breaking apart in long silver cracks. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and cedar of life trying again. Samuel Reed came home from the hospital 2 weeks after the storm. His steps were slower now, his heart still weak, but his eyes carried something new, a quiet gratitude that softened the lines in his face. When the truck pulled up to his cabin, Ranger jumped down, first landing in the slush with a soft thud. He turned, waiting for Samuel like a soldier awaiting orders. "Go on, boy," Samuel said, smiling faintly. "We made it back." Inside, the cabin felt different. Maybe it was the smell of medicine and hospital still clinging to him, or maybe it was just the awareness that he'd almost never seen this place again. He stood for a long time by the fireplace, watching the ashes from the storm's last fire still faintly clinging to the grate. Ranger walked in circles, inspecting everything as if making sure it was safe, the chair, the stove, the window, and finally Samuel himself. When he was satisfied, he lay down by the man's boots with a sigh, tail curling neatly over his paws. Samuel sat down slowly, rubbing the dog's head. "You really stayed, didn't you?" he said softly. "Didn't matter what it cost you." Ranger looked up, eyes steady. The kind of gaze that doesn't need words to answer. Recovery came in small steps. Every morning Samuel brewed coffee, just 1 cup now. The second mug still sat on the table, but it wasn't for morning anymore. It was a quiet salute to Helen, to the storm, to the strange miracle that now breathed at his feet. He wrote down the days in a small field notebook, the same kind he used in the Marines. But instead of coordinates or weather reports, he filled it with notes about Ranger. Day 3, stayed by my bed all night. Day 5, checks the door each morning before I wake. Day 7, responds to voice, follows commands without training. Day 9, brought my boot to the chair before I could bend. He'd never seen loyalty like that, not even in men who'd shared foxholes with him. Laura Hayes, the ranger who had helped rescue him, stopped by every few days to check in. She'd bring groceries or news from town, and each time she saw the dog by Samuel's side, she'd shake her head. "You two are something else," she said. "He's not just watching over you, he's keeping you going." Samuel would smile. "He's the only nurse who doesn't nag." One afternoon, Laura lingered by the door before leaving. "You know," she said, "that dog didn't just find me by accident. He had to run a mile through a blizzard to get there. That's not instinct, that's love." Samuel looked down at Ranger, who lay calmly by the fire. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I'm starting to understand that." The weeks passed. Samuel grew stronger. The color returned to his face, and he began taking short walks along the lake again. Ranger always led the way a few steps ahead, ears high head, turning every few seconds to make sure the old man was keeping up. Sometimes they'd stop at the ridge where the forest opened wide and the lake stretched like a mirror below. Samuel would rest his hands on his knees, breathing in the cold air, and say, "Never thought I'd see another spring, boy. Guess we fooled him, huh?" Ranger would sit beside him, tail sweeping the snow eyes, following the clouds drifting over the mountains. It became their daily ritual, one man and one dog standing quietly at the edge of survival, both changed by what they had endured together. At night, Samuel started drawing again. Not just sketches, now full portraits. Ranger sitting alert in the doorway, Ranger curled by the fire. Ranger's eyes catching the morning light. He'd add small notes beneath each drawing. "Still guards the door. Barked at thunder today, hates it. Lays his head on my hand when I can't sleep." Sometimes Samuel would set the drawing aside and talk to the dog in that low, gravelly voice that only men who have seen too much can manage. "You know, Helen used to say I was too hard to love. Maybe she was right. But you didn't ask anything of me. You just stayed." Ranger would lift his head and press his muzzle gently against Samuel's knee. That single gesture said everything that words couldn't. One evening, as the sun melted into the lake, Samuel sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket. The air was cool, the kind that tasted of pine and thawing soil. Ranger lay beside him, ears flicking every now and then at the sound of distant loons. Samuel took out his notebook and wrote slowly, carefully, "A man spends his life trying to be strong. But maybe strength isn't standing alone. Maybe it's having something worth standing for." He set the notebook down and looked at the shepherd beside him. "You know," he said softly, "I thought I saved you. But now I think it's the other way around." Ranger lifted his head, those deep brown eyes steady and calm. The man chuckled, voice low. "Yeah," he said, "I thought you'd agree." The dog rested his head on Samuel's boot, and for a long time neither moved. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke, and in the fading light the cabin no longer looked lonely. It looked like home. That night Samuel placed a new drawing above the mantel, a pencil sketch of Ranger lying across the hearth, one paw extended toward the viewer. Beneath it he wrote a single line in Helen's handwriting, copied from an old letter she'd once written him in the hospital. "Love isn't about keeping, it's about giving something a reason to stay." He read it aloud once, then turned to Ranger. "Well, looks like you gave me mine." The shepherd blinked slow, then gave a quiet sigh, curling closer to the fire. Outside, the snowmelt whispered down the mountain, the lake breathing again after months of silence. And inside the cabin, the heart that had nearly stopped beating found its rhythm steady, strong, and shared between two souls who no longer needed words to understand each other. By the time spring finally arrived, the world around White Pine Lake had changed. The lake thawed in slow, heavy sighs. Ice cracked in long, echoing lines that rolled across the water like thunder beneath the surface. The pine trees stretched tall again, their dark branches shaking off months of snow. And for the first time in years, Samuel Reed felt like the thaw had reached him too. He'd stopped counting the days since the storm. Now he measured time in smaller ways, the sound of water dripping from the eaves, the first robin singing before dawn, and the way Ranger's fur caught the sunlight when they walked the ridge above the lake. The two had settled into an easy rhythm. Samuel split logs. Ranger fetched the small pieces that fell. Samuel cooked breakfast. Ranger waited patiently by the door until the man slid a portion to his bowl. Sometimes they spoke well. Samuel spoke in half-finished thoughts. "You ever think we both just got lucky, boy?" he'd ask. Ranger would give him that same slow blink, the kind that meant, I'm still here. It was a peaceful life, predictable, healing. Until one morning, as Samuel sat on the porch sketching, he heard the distant growl of an engine, a sound that didn't belong to the forest. He shaded his eyes against the sun and saw a truck winding down the old gravel road toward the cabin. His first thought was Laura Hayes, the ranger. But as the vehicle came closer, his heart skipped not from pain this time, but from memory. The door opened and a man stepped out. Broad-shouldered, early 30s hair, wind-tossed, and eyes so familiar that Samuel felt the air leave his chest. Aaron. For a moment neither spoke. Then from the passenger side came a small voice, light, curious, full of life. Grandpa. A little girl jumped down, clutching a stuffed bear almost her size. Her hair was tied in messy pigtails and her blue jacket hung a little too big for her small frame. Lily. Samuel blinked hard. Well, I'll be, he whispered. Ranger standing beside him gave a low bark, not warning, just surprise. His tail swayed once, then again. The girl's eyes lit up. Is that him? The dog from the picture? Samuel nodded, his throat too tight for words. Ranger stepped forward slowly, cautious but curious. Lily crouched down, holding out her small hand. The dog sniffed once, twice, then pressed his nose gently against her fingers. The child giggled. He's soft. Aaron walked up, his voice rougher than Samuel remembered. Hey, Dad, he said quietly. Heard about what happened. Figured it was time I stopped calling from so far away. Samuel chuckled softly, shaking his head. Took you long enough. Aaron smiled faintly. Yeah, guess it did. For a long time, the three of them, man, son, and child, stood there beneath the tall pines saying little. Sometimes family doesn't need words. Sometimes just showing up is enough. That evening, Samuel cooked a real dinner for the first time in years, salmon bread, potatoes, and coffee. Aaron brought out a pie from town. Lily fed Ranger bits of crust under the table when she thought no one was watching. The cabin smelled of food and laughter and something that had been missing for too long, belonging. After dinner, Lily sat on the rug beside the fire, stroking Ranger's fur. Daddy says you saved Grandpa, she said softly. Is that true? Ranger tilted his head, eyes warm tail brushing the floor once. Samuel chuckled. If that dog could talk, he'd probably tell you I was a handful. Lily grinned. I think he likes you anyway. Aaron leaned back in the old wooden chair, watching them. You look good, Dad. Better than you have in years. Samuel took a slow sip of coffee. That's because I stopped talking to ghosts. He nodded toward Ranger, and started listening to this one instead. Aaron's smile faded into something gentler, understanding. I missed you, he said quietly. Samuel looked up the firelight, catching the edges of his face. I missed you too, son. More than I said. Lily, oblivious to the gravity in the room, was now trying to braid Ranger's fur. The dog lay still, patient as stone, occasionally turning his head to give her a small lick on the wrist. The sight made both men laugh, a sound that filled the cabin like music. The next morning, Samuel woke early, the house still quiet. He brewed 3 cups of coffee this time, one for himself, one for Aaron, and one for the empty chair that had always belonged to Helen. Outside, mist rolled over the lake like soft smoke. Ranger sat on the porch, keeping watch as he always did. When Samuel stepped outside, he heard small footsteps behind him. Lily patted out in her socks, yawning. Morning, Grandpa. Morning, sweetheart. He smiled. You're up early. She pointed at Ranger. He was sitting here, so I came to sit too. Samuel nodded. That's a good reason. They sat together in silence, an old man, a little girl, and a dog who seemed to belong to both worlds. After a while, Lily said, Daddy told me you draw. Can you show me? Samuel smiled and went inside. When he came back, he carried the sketchbook, the one filled with drawings of Ranger. He opened it to a page of pencil lines that had become his story. Ranger in the snow. Ranger sleeping by the fire. Ranger's eyes meeting his own. Lily looked in awe. He looks so real. He is, Samuel said softly. Every line here is something I didn't want to forget. Can you draw me with him? She asked. He hesitated, then smiled. Yeah, I think I can do that. Later that afternoon, Aaron watched from the porch as his father and daughter sat side by side, the old man sketching the girl holding still while Ranger lay between them. The sun spilled gold across the lake, and the laughter drifting from the yard sounded like it belonged to another time, a time before loss, before distance, before silence. Aaron felt something in his chest loosen, the same thing his father had felt months before. When Samuel finished, he turned the sketchbook around to show them. The drawing was rough but full of life. A little girl smiling, her hand resting on the neck of a shepherd whose eyes seemed to understand everything. He wrote underneath spring and return day 120. He looked up, eyes bright. "You see that, Ranger? We're family now." The dog wagged his tail once slow and sure, then rested his head on Lily's knee. The girl leaned down and whispered, "Don't worry, Ranger. We're not leaving you." And somehow Samuel knew she meant it not just for the dog, but for him too. That night, as the stars rose over the thawing lake, Samuel sat by the fire with Aaron and Lily asleep nearby. Ranger lay beside him, eyes half closed, breathing slow and steady. The house was quiet, but not the lonely kind. For the first time in years, the silence sounded like peace. If winter had tested the soul, then spring came as its apology. The snow melted into the soil, feeding the first shoots of green that pushed through the thaw. The lake shimmered like polished glass under the soft light. And for the first time in years, Samuel Reed could hear laughter in his yard again, the kind of laughter that made the air feel young. It belonged to Lily, his granddaughter, whose voice carried like a bell through the trees. And wherever her laughter went, Ranger followed. From the first morning she woke up in the cabin, they became inseparable. When she ran down to the lake, Ranger trotted beside her, keeping perfect pace. When she drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, he sat close watching with quiet fascination. And when she lay on the porch reading stories aloud, he rested his head in her lap, eyes half closed, as if listening to every word. Samuel watched them from his chair near the door, a blanket over his knees, coffee in hand. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of a child's voice, the questions, the little giggles, the way wonder could make even silence feel alive. Grandpa Lily called one morning, "Why does Ranger always look at me like that?" Samuel smiled. "Because he's trying to figure out what kind of trouble you're planning." She laughed, crouching beside the dog. "He looks serious, but I think he likes me." "Trust me," Samuel said. "If he didn't, you'd know." She whispered something into Ranger's ear, then something only he would understand. The shepherd blinked, slow, gave a soft chuff, and wagged his tail once solemn approval, the kind only good dogs know how to give. Over the next few weeks, the cabin transformed into something new, a place where the ghosts of the past made room for the sounds of the living. There were crayons on the table now alongside Samuel's sketchbook. There was laughter spilling from the porch, and there was movement, footsteps that belonged to more than one person. Samuel began sketching again, this time both of them together, Lily and Ranger. He drew her with her hand resting on his head, both looking toward the lake, both smiling at something unseen. Underneath the drawing, he wrote, "April 14th. She trusts him already." At night, when Lily slept upstairs, Samuel would look at the drawing again and think about how strange and beautiful life could be. How a stray dog had led to a storm to a rescue, and a rescue to this, a family restored. He often spoke quietly to Helen's photograph on the mantel. "You'd love her," he'd say softly. "She's got your kindness and your stubbornness." Then he'd glance down at Ranger lying by the fire. "You, though, you made all this happen." The dog would lift his head, meeting Samuel's gaze, and in that silent understanding, there was gratitude, shared, wordless, real. One bright afternoon, Lily and Ranger were out in the yard, while Samuel sat nearby with his sketchbook. The girl was tossing pine cones into the air, and Ranger leapt to catch them, sometimes succeeding, sometimes missing, but always trying. Each time he landed, Lily clapped and laughed so hard she nearly fell over. "Good boy," she shouted. "You're the best dog in the world," Ranger barked once proudly, as if he understood every word. Samuel laughed, a sound that had been rare for too long. "Careful, sweetheart," he called. "If you spoil him too much, he won't listen to me anymore." Lily giggled. "That's okay, Grandpa. He listens to me just fine." Samuel pretended to grumble. "Oh, I see how it is. I feed him, I chop the wood, and you get all the loyalty." But inside his heart was lighter than it had been in years. There was something healing about watching youth and devotion play together, about seeing love move forward through generations. That evening, as the sky turned pink over the lake, Lily sat beside her grandfather on the porch steps, her head resting against his arm. Ranger lay at their feet, tail curled, eyes half closed. "Grandpa," she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy told me you got sick in the snow. Were you scared?" Samuel took a slow breath. "A little. Mostly I was tired. Did Ranger save you?" He nodded. He did. He ran through a storm to find help. Lily looked down at the shepherd, her eyes wide. "That's brave." Samuel smiled faintly. "Braver than most men I've known." She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "When I grow up, I want to be brave too." "You already are," he said. She grinned. "Then I'll stay brave just like Ranger." The dog opened one eye at the sound of his name, gave a soft sigh, and pressed his paw against the girl's shoe as if confirming her promise. That night, when the others were asleep, Samuel sat alone at the table. The fire was low, the room bathed in amber light. He opened his sketchbook to a blank page and began to write instead of draw. For Lily and Ranger, he wrote, "Some bonds are written in words, others are written in the quiet between heartbeats. When a child laughs and a dog listens, the world feels whole again." He closed the book, looked over at the dog sleeping near the door, and whispered, "You gave her something I never could, a childhood filled with trust." Then he turned his eyes toward the window where the moonlight spilled across the lake like silver paint. Somewhere beyond that horizon, he liked to think Helen was smiling. In the morning, Lily found the drawing Samuel had left on the table, her and Ranger side by side looking out at the lake. Underneath, in his careful handwriting, were 3 words, "My heart's echo." She ran to him, the paper clutched in her small hands. "Grandpa, you drew me again." He smiled. "I had to. You and Ranger. You're my best work." Lily hugged him tight, then turned to hug Ranger too, pressing her cheek against his neck. And when the dog leaned into her embrace, Samuel realized something simple and profound. The world gives back sometimes. Not all at once, not loudly but quietly, like spring thawing the last of winter's ice. And as he watched them, his granddaughter and his dog, he whispered to himself, "I've lived long enough to see what love looks like when it comes home." Years passed quietly at White Pine Lake, the way time always does when a place has finally found peace. The seasons came and went, each leaving their own kind of mark. Spring brought color to the valley again, summer warmed the air with the scent of pine and river water, and autumn painted the mountains gold. Then winter returned, soft and familiar, not as an enemy anymore, but as an old friend who knew its welcome. Through it all, Samuel Reed stayed in his cabin, never far from the porch, the lake, or Ranger. His hair turned silver, his hands grew slower, but his eyes still carried that quiet steadiness that the Marines had built, and life had softened. He moved slower now, but he didn't mind. The world no longer needed rushing. Ranger had aged too. His muzzle was gray around the edges, and the once sleek coat had grown rougher, but his eyes, those deep brown, steady eyes, were the same. He followed Samuel from room to room, still the silent guardian he had always been, his movements careful but loyal to the last step. Lily had grown taller. Her pigtails had turned into long waves of hair she often braided herself. She still came every summer, running across the porch the moment she arrived, arms wide open for both her grandfather and the dog that had been her first best friend. Ranger, though slower, always met her halfway. "Hey, old boy," she'd whisper, kneeling to hold him. "You still remember me, don't you?" And every time he'd give that same soft sigh, lean his head against her shoulder and wag his tail, slow content, like time itself nodding. Yes. One late afternoon, near the end of another golden summer, Samuel sat on the porch while Lily painted near the steps. The light was soft, drifting through the trees like something sacred. Ranger lay between them, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. Samuel looked out over the lake and said quietly, "You know, I used to think peace was something you had to fight for." Lily turned her head. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I think peace is what comes when you finally stop fighting." She set her paintbrush down, resting her chin on her knees. "I like it here, Grandpa. Everything feels gentle." He nodded. "That's what your grandmother always wanted. A place where the world could be kind again." Ranger stirred, lifting his head as if hearing Helen's name in the air. Samuel reached down, brushing his fingers through the dog's fur. "You did that too, didn't you, boy? Made the world kind again?" Lily smiled. "He's part of this place." Samuel looked at her eyes, warm. "So are you." That night when the fire crackled low and the stars shimmered over the lake, Samuel sat at the old table with his sketchbook. The pages were filled with drawings: Ranger Lily, the cabin, the lake through every season. On the last blank page he drew the three of them together: an old man sitting on the porch, a young girl painting by his side, and a shepherd lying between them, his gaze turned toward the horizon. Beneath it he wrote slowly, "The Circle of Light, Day 1032. Then in smaller letters, "Because every ending is just a quieter beginning." He closed the book gently, set it beside Helen's old photograph, and whispered, "We did all right, didn't we?" Ranger, lying near the hearth, gave a soft, contented sigh. Samuel smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I thought so." The next morning came gentle and bright. The sky was a perfect blue, the kind that belongs to early autumn. Lily found her grandfather still sitting in his chair on the porch, his sketchbook closed on his lap, his hand resting lightly on Ranger's head. He looked peaceful, like a man who had finished a long, hard march and finally come home. The lake shimmered in front of him, catching the light in a way that made it hard to tell where water ended and sky began. Ranger stayed beside him until evening, refusing food, his body still but his eyes fixed on the same horizon. When the last light faded, he lifted his head, once gazed out toward the lake, and rested it again against the boot of the man he had chosen to love. By morning, he too had gone still. A week later, the cabin filled with people: Aaron, Lily, Laura Hayes, and a few of the locals who'd known the story. They buried Samuel Reed beneath the tall pines overlooking the lake, the same place where he'd once stood after the storm that changed everything. Beside him, under a smooth, flat stone, they buried Ranger. Lily placed a hand-carved wooden plaque at the head of both graves. Her grandfather had made it years ago, never knowing it would mark his own resting place. It read simply, "Please let him be." She traced the letters with her fingers, tears shining, but not bitter. Then she whispered, "He's not alone. Neither of you ever will be." Every summer after that, Lily came back to the cabin. She grew up, became an artist, painting dogs and people and quiet landscapes, the kind that made you feel you'd seen them before, even if you hadn't. She said it was because every canvas she painted carried a little of that Montana light, and two shapes she'd never forget: a man and his shepherd. And on the porch of that old cabin, where the wood had grayed and the wind still smelled of cedar, a single drawing remained framed on the wall. 3 figures under the golden sky, the man, the girl, and the dog beneath it. Her grandfather's final words: "Love isn't about keeping, it's about giving something a reason to stay." Years later, when people asked Lily where her art came from, she'd smile and say, "From a winter that almost took everything, and a dog that gave it all back." Sometimes she'd take her daughter, a small girl, with her same bright laugh up to White Pine Lake. They'd stand beneath the pines listening to the wind, and Lily would tell her, "This is where your great-grandpa found his best friend." And when the breeze shifted, stirring the leaves, the little girl would say, "Mom, did you hear that? I think the dog's still here." Lily would smile softly, eyes glistening. "Yeah, sweetheart," she'd whisper. "I think they both are." The sun would dip low, spilling gold across the lake. And for a moment, if you stood quiet enough, you could almost hear it, the faint echo of footsteps on the porch, a soft bark carried by the wind, and the low voice of an old man saying, "Come on, boy. Time to go home."